Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Key Thoughts on Controlling Pharmacy Spend for Hospitals. I am Maggie Moran with Becker's Hospital Review. Today's program will be a moderated discussion followed by an audience Q&A. Our moderator today is Scott Becker, publisher of Becker's Hospital Review. If you have any questions throughout the program, you can submit them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and click Send. We will get through as many questions as we have time for in the Q&A. Today's program will also be recorded and will be available following the live event. At this time, it's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Scott Becker to begin today's discussion. Scott?
Thank you for joining us today. Again, as Maggie said, we're going to talk about key thoughts on controlling pharmacy spend for hospitals and health systems. We've got four great panelists. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. We're going to talk through about 5 core questions, then audience questions if the audience has them. Without much more delay, we'll spend about 5 to 8 minutes on each question. Let me start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves. Cedric, can I start with you?
Sure, and good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to participate, Scott and Maggie. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cedric Terrell. I'm a Senior Vice President and Chief Pharmacy Executive for Novant Health. We're an integrated delivery network based out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We have about 15 medical centers. We have 15 medical centers, and we have well over 550 clinic locations with 4,000 or so physicians and advanced care practitioners, and our pharmacists are part of that group. My role at Novant Health is I participate on our senior leadership team, executive team for accountability and executive leadership and oversight for anything in regards to appropriate use of medicines for our health system across the continuum. We have both acute and ambulatory clinical pharmacy services. We have retail pharmacy. We have mail and home delivery services, specialty pharmacy, and call center operations throughout our pharmacy enterprise. So it's a pleasure to be on the call.
Thank you, Cedric, so much. And Luke, how about yourself?
Certainly. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here today. I am Luke Miller and currently Director of Pharmacy within the Ascension Texas Network at Seton Medical Center Hayes, just outside of Austin, Texas. I obtained a doctorate of pharmacy from the University of Pittsburgh in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, followed by a PGY1 pharmacy residency at UF Health Jacksonville in Jacksonville, Florida, and shortly thereafter a Master's of Business Administration degree. I'm also actively involved in TSHP and ASHP, where I currently serve as a chair for Clinical Leadership Section Advisory Group for the ASHP section of Clinical Specialists and Scientists. I'm happy to be here today.
And thank you so much for joining us. Dean Perry, Dean, do you want to take a moment and introduce yourself, and then we'll have Chuck do so?
Sure. Thank you very much for the chance to be here. I am Dean Perry. I'm the AVP for Clinical Informatics for the Geisinger Health System, and I sit on the Enterprise Pharmacy Leadership Team and am responsible for obviously the informatics portion of it, overseeing the informatics process from a pharmacy perspective, but also oversee analytics, which we utilize heavily in this process of trying to manage and control spend. Geisinger is a health system fully integrated health system located in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, and consists of 11 hospitals and about 120 ambulatory clinics.
Thank you very much. And Chuck, yourself. Chuck Daniels, do I have you there? Let me do this. I wonder if Chuck got, oh, there you go. Yeah. Thank you so much. Chuck, can you introduce yourself briefly?
Thanks for allowing me to join the group. My name is Chuck Daniels. I'm the Chief Pharmacy Officer and Associate Dean at the University of California, San Diego Health and the Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. We are essentially the academic medical center in San Diego County. We offer an integrated network that includes both ambulatory and hospital care. We have a pharmacy enterprise that covers both inpatient, ambulatory specialty, and several other functional areas that are part of the UC San Diego Health Pharmacy Enterprise. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for our audience, we're really going to work through 5 questions today. I'll start the first question with Chuck and go back around the horn and come back with Cedric. The 5 questions that we're going to talk about are, what are the top drivers of pharmacy cost today? What are the most successful steps that you're taking to control cost? Third, is cost control about better negotiation and pricing? Is it about not using certain pharmaceuticals, better reimbursement, or what really drives it? The fourth question, what technology is helpful? What's been the most useful technology you've added on? And the fifth question is sort of the what seems uncontrollable, whether it's specialty drugs, specialty pharma, non-generics, what are the drugs or the costs that seem non-controllable that's really hard to get your hands around? But Chuck, let me start with you. The top, and I'm going to ask each panelist each time to talk for no more than 30 to 90 seconds maximum, and we'll come back around to people. Chuck, the top drivers of pharmacy costs at your system today.
Well, I think that the top drivers at our shop are much like many of you are seeing. We have an oncology service, and oncology drugs are expensive, and the new drugs are quite expensive. And so both on the inpatient side as well as in our clinic operations and infusion operations, the single largest driver of our drug spend is the cost of the oncology drugs. And so that is the critical point for us in terms of looking at opportunity, but it's not the only one out there. Certain other service lines are really important to us and drive a fair amount of drug costs. Our critical care services and several of the other transplant services are big drivers. And so we always look at those service lines as places, the starting points for things to look at.
So Chuck, what I heard you say, and the biggest areas of cost, oncology drugs, critical care, transplant drugs. Am I missing anything?
No, those are the leading cost drivers.
And let me switch to Dean. Your thoughts on the same question. Your main drivers of cost, and where do you see the biggest cost?
Well, I think that Chuck's correct, that those are key drivers. We certainly see significant cost in the specialty pharmacy area as we look not only in oncology, which fits into that, but other areas such as GI, rheumatology, growing in the neurological area. We have a very large MS population, so there's significant cost involved in those areas. I think the other driver that becomes difficult to manage is the drug shortage issue and how that forces us outside of our standard purchasing practices, often to higher cost alternatives, which certainly is a factor in driving the overall cost of pharmaceuticals across the system.
Fascinating. So specialty MS, drug shortages, which force you outside of your normal protocols, and then you end up spending more during those periods of time. Really thoughtful and helpful. Luke, same question. Where are your biggest drivers of pharma cost?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with the group. First and foremost, you really see biologics, specialty pharmacy, really those agents that come to market and have that market exclusivity. Followed closely behind, really, again, drug shortages. Not only do at times we have to switch to a more costly alternative, but there's also significant costs associated with the time and expense for those alternatives, IT and automation, communication, potentially non-contracted products. And then also another key one I think to mention is really pharmaceutical inflation. When you look for really 2015 to 2017, you see total hospital drug spend increased over 15% as a relation to inflation. And I think that's another key driver that really should be mentioned.
Gotcha. Just aside from the specialty pharma, drug shortages, biologics, just pure inflation in pharma cost. There's seems to be one of the areas in healthcare that seems to be just the hardest for people to get their hands around controlling. Cedric, same question, and then anything new that you've seen in the last few years that's been a real driver of cost?
Yeah, Scott, I think I'm right there with our partners around drivers for cost. I think I would bundle them in three categories, like my peers have alluded to. For us at Novant, the first one is shift in care delivery modeling. So when I look at our footprint and where we spend, it's our spend for our health system is well over $300 million. 1/3 of that is in our acute care space, and 2/3 is in our outpatient space, whether it be from an infusion, retail, or clinic setting. Then I look at the top, the novel therapies that we move. As we know, medications are basically the number one modality of treatment. So antineoplastics, like Chuck alluded to, like Rituxan, immunoglobulins, or IVIG drugs used like Privigen. And then when we look at immunomodulators or breakthrough therapies like Ocrevus for multiple sclerosis, those are top drivers for us, but we latch on to that because of our integrated delivery model, our service lines, and how we're changing. So I shift right back to the shifting care delivery modeling. And of course, the drug shortage is something that keeps us up at night for sure.
So fascinating. You've mentioned three things, and you were the first person to put a number on this spend, which is really, really helpful for audience context. The shift in care delivery, and you mentioned that 2/3 of your spend is inpatient and 2/3 is outpatient. I think you said 1/3 inpatient, 2/3 outpatient.
That's correct.
Then novel therapies, sort of newer therapies, more expansive therapies, and you mentioned something fascinating too, different than a generation ago where surgery might have been the predominant method of trying to cure or fix something. Now it sounds like pharmaceuticals are, as much as anything else, the core type of way of trying to solve a medical problem. And then you mentioned drug shortages, and everybody's mentioned that as well. And so a fascinating take on it. Let me ask you about that $300 million number and inflation. And it's a little bit hard to judge because Novant has grown so much over the years. But how is that number growing per year, that $300 million number?
Well, I think it's when you look at the national trends, and I believe Luke alluded to it around the inflation percentage. So when you talk about the pharmacy supply chain in its totality, I think Peter Bach does a great job of summarizing that. We're talking about nearly a $500 billion industry in the pharmacy supply chain. And so when you look at your spend, there's spend across that footprint, depending on where we deliver care. And so at Novant Health, when we look at that delivery care model, we see, of course, year over year in our acute care space, anywhere from a 3 to 5% drug inflation across the acute care spend. But then when we look on the ambulatory side, self-injectables, the infusion therapy, clinic-based injectables, so forth and so on, and the specialty drugs, of course, that fall into that basket, is where we see that 8 to 12% continuous rise year over year, which is driving our inflation in our costs.
Got it. So overall, what I'm hearing in a lot of systems is about 8 to 10% increase in cost per year. And you break it down well between the mix that's inpatient rising at 3 to 5% and the variety of the other areas that are rising at a higher percentage. Fair assessment?
Fair assessment, yeah.
Thank you. And so let me ask you the follow-up question and come back around the turn on this. What's the most successful steps you've taken at Novant to control cost?
Yeah, that's a broad. I mean, we could approach that in a multitude of ways. So let me try to put it into maybe three categories, Scott, and keep it brief. I would say the first is alignment and integration. So because we're an integrated delivery network and we're focused on clinical delivery, we've got to have strong integrations from anything from our system formulary. So we have one formulary for our health system that's across our footprint, multi-state, from a multi-state premise. Then we look at core principles and governance. So do we have our pharmacy representation in all of our service lines and where we supply services across our health system, able to help with appropriate use and selection of drugs, and also the follow-up and care for those patients as they leave our walls and they go back to their homes. And then the last piece I would say is just the bricks and mortar, which is strategic levers and tactics that we consistently look at and use, say for instance, like contracting, inventory management. When we look at site of care optimization in regards to infusion therapies, is it best to use that in the acute care space or in our hospital-owned outpatient or in our clinic infusion centers, specialty pharmacy, being able to give the wraparound services for unique or novel therapies for patients, utilization management, so forth and so on. So there's a cadre of different tactics that we can use, but I would put those in those three buckets. And just to come back, it would be alignment and integration, core principles and governance under the pharmacy umbrella and footprint, and strategic levers and tactics that we use on a routine basis in our pharmacy enterprise.
Thank you very much. Luke, let me get you to follow up on that and also to focus on at least one question, and it is the one formulary concept. I know you're a medical center in Austin, but you're also part of a major system, Ascension. How aggressive about implementing one formulary across the system within a region? How does a place like Ascension look at that? And what are the most successful things you guys are doing on controlling cost?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Really, as far as becoming heading towards one formulary, I think that's a consistent mission, and I think you'll see many large networks are heading in that direction. Really kind of looking at some points that Cedric touched upon. Really any contracting opportunities, really leveraging that market competition. We touched a little bit on biologics and market exclusivity. Something really interesting coming to market is the concept of biosimilars and where they play into things. Also, something that I think has really been successful is taking a critical appraisal of the medical literature and really leading with quality evidence. So if we have a clinical scenario and we have multiple agents, they're really taking a hard stance and evaluating, does this agent have a clearly driven benefit, and more so than the risk that it might pose? And then if we have multiple agents, really choosing the one that we might be able to have the best cost opportunity on.
And how aggressive or definitive are those discussions about, is one agent better than another, and what's the cost differential? How is that? I know it's an impossible question, so I apologize for asking it, but how do people judge that across different drugs or different pharmaceuticals, and then compare costs on them?
Yeah, well, I think to really start the discussion, you have to take a step back and really focus on doing what's right for the patient. First and foremost, you have to focus on, what is the most safe and efficacious product we have on the market, and does one show a clearly delineated benefit over another? And if that's the case, then you go with that agent. If there's multiple out there that really have similar evidence or comparable evidence, that's really when you have the contracting opportunities. And something else that I think is really interesting that is really kind of in the early stages for a lot of the larger health networks is a couple are actually going out and to really address kind of the root cause of some of the problems is they're innovating and actually forming generic drug companies. Ascension has partnered with Trinity Health and Intermountain Healthcare, and there's a couple other models out, like similar models out there that are really focusing on shipping the medications directly to the hospitals. And those are really in the beginning stages, but I think that's something that'll be very interesting to watch.
And let me ask you a question on that. I've seen the large not-for-profit chain efforts, and I applaud it for developing a generic drug company. How important a part of the puzzle is that? Because it seems like where systems are really getting blasted or hurt is on the non-generic side, where a drug company says, we're the only game in town, and so there's no commoditization, and we can, really price how we want to price. So my question is, on the generic side, is that being attacked by the not-for-profits because it's actually attackable, even though the bigger spend is in the non-generic area? Just educate me, because I'm not, I don't obviously come to this with the knowledge you have. I'm coming to it with sort of a layperson's thoughts almost.
Sure. Well, I think really a lot of that remains to be seen. We talked a little bit about drug shortages. So even from a process standpoint, drug shortages alone are a major risk to our health and health systems. And really what we'll see is when the drug shortage comes into place that many times the only other alternative might be that more expensive branded product. So really driving the innovation in that sector.
Somebody was going to add something on there. Go ahead.
Scott, this is Dean. Yeah, I think I'd like to jump in here because this is something I've spent a lot of time working on. I think we first underplay the cost that these shortages create for our health systems. I mean, we look at the cost of the drug, and if you're purely looking at drug cost, you are absolutely correct. It's such a small dollar amount compared to other things, it's not going to make that big of an impact. But when you think about the total cost, the impact, first of all, simply on IT systems and changes that need to be made, the risk that it creates in terms of errors that could occur as you try to adjust to alternative therapies, and the number of people involved in the impact on quality of care, I think the number gets inflated by a significant factor. 5-10 times the cost of the drug is involved in additional costs and time taken away from our ability to work on other innovative processes which would help to move the systems forward. So I think there's way more cost hidden there than people would realize.
I agree.
That's really helpful to understanding it, because even if the generics themselves are just a smaller part of the problem, and the hope is that some kind of combined generic drug company by the big not-for-profits can help solve this, the shortages problem creates huge other costs that end up trending away from, they don't show up as generic costs, but they show up as real pharmacy costs either way. Fascinating perspective. Dean, let me ask you to follow on that. Luke, we'll come back to you in a couple moments. Dean, to follow on, the single most important thing that your system is doing, and Geisinger is a huge system, really successful system. Tell us the most important thing you're doing to help reduce pharmacy cost.
And that is, as was said before, I think is a difficult question, and many of the things that Novant's doing, we are doing. I think the key where we've come in an area that's worth focusing on is the process of analytics. So in terms of looking at our internal data, and yes, examining drugs from the outside and the benefit, the value equation, but looking at it internally and really trying to focus in on our population and our opportunities, and then examining that in terms of the total cost of care. Pharmacy is clearly, and health systems are clearly moving away from the siloed approach to cost, and I think pharmacy has a huge opportunity to drive that process, and what we're doing at Geisinger is really not just doing the analytics, but driving the decision across the organization by showing them the benefit to the organization as a whole, rather than just focusing in on the cost of drugs. And sometimes that means a more expensive agent that has a lower total cost of care, and sometimes it's the opposite. It really depends on the outcomes that you're seeing from within your patient population.
Sure, and I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Let me get Chuck into this conversation. Chuck, you're again, huge system, part of the UC system, highly successful system. Best things that have worked on controlling drug costs. Is there anything you could point to that's been, Cedric talked a lot about driving things towards formularies, and how they manage those. Luke talked about a number of things. Dean commented on why generics really and shortages really do create huge problems for costs. and that it's more about the overall best care for the patient than anything else. Chuck, some of your thoughts on controlling cost?
Yeah, so just really a few thoughts in terms of things that I believe. One of them is has already been stated, and that is that analytics, metrics, numbers really help set the table for successful activities. But at the bottom of all of this, everything that we've done that's been successful is about persistence. And I say that because knowing where your opportunities are is very important, and that only comes from either some smart computer program that identifies opportunities or some really thoughtful individuals that are looking at where the money spent is at. But the reality is that just knowing that they're there frequently doesn't drive the change. And so that persistence, we have a regular team that meets, and their only real reason to meet is to talk about opportunities that are out there that might drive the drug cost per patient day down. And we really focus on that activity. And for that group, we really concentrate on inpatient activity only, because as pointed out, a fair amount of our spend, as true many places, has now moved to the outpatient side. But because you can't do everything at once, we've really worked hard to try and make sure that the inpatient opportunities, that we have those, have a long list. We don't get to all of them, but we have a list and we keep track of them. And we meet once a month to make sure that whatever I said I was going to do last month, or anybody else on that committee said they were going to do last month, that they either did it or that they're working on it. And I don't think I can understate the importance of good, hard work in order to be able to make those changes.
No, I think you've answered it, a terrific answer, and I've really heard you say two or three things. One, it's not so much that there's a magic bullet. More and more we've got the analytics that show where the costs are. Two, a lot of it is not just getting the data, but consistent persistence and efforts to work with the data and try and solve the problem. Just it's a lot of it's consistent hard work and execution. The third thing you said that I thought was also really insightful was we're focusing our efforts where we think we can make a difference. So, and it's not that we can't make it in a lot of different places, but for the moment we're focusing on our efforts on the inpatient side where we feel like we've got a better ability to impact it, at least near term.
Yeah, that's a true statement, and I guess I'll also sort of add to that. In the era when some of the drugs that we're seeing come into the therapeutic arsenal are very expensive. You know, you're adding $20,000 a year, $40,000, $100,000 a year to add this particular therapy. It's easy to be distracted from the stuff that can save money that is doable with the tools that you have at hand. So I don't dismiss the big ticket opportunities, but I think you have to also remind yourselves and the rest of the people on the team that there's a lot of opportunity that doesn't require that you change or generate new research to prove things. They're just out there, and we sort of can look past them because we're thinking about the next expensive item that came onto our formulary. And, you know, I think from that perspective, you know, trying to make sure you define initiatives that engage not just the pharmacists, because, you know, our administrators typically think that we have good control over that, but the nurses, the physicians, those are all people within our organization that we've said, how about if we partner up on this or that or whatever. So from our list, many of them are things that don't require only a pharmacy intervention. And that's kind of the approach that we've tried to do, is to engage other disciplines in helping us manage our drug cost per patient day.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, and I'm not sure if you didn't sort of already hit this already. And this is the question, and we're moving to the next question, and we'll go back around the horn here. Is cost control about better negotiation and pricing? Is it about not using certain pharmaceuticals, better reimbursement, or what? And you've partially answered them. Maybe you could summarize again.
Sure.
Is it just inflation, negotiation? Go ahead.
No, I see it as all three of those in different cases. There are certain items that, formulary standardization allows you to drive better negotiating positions, and I think those are important to do for some drugs. I think managing your drug use pattern, medication use evaluations, those are things that help you define whether or not you are using it the way the P&T committee felt it was originally supported and the way the literature supports. So I think that holds an important opportunity. And in certain of the areas, we talk about particular drugs in terms of reimbursement, and it's become more and more important for us to know what exactly happens with a particular drug, especially some of these high-ticket items that is very unlikely to be captured within the standard, I'll call it inpatient reimbursement scheme. So I think it's all three.
Meaning it's not covered in the reimbursement scheme, so you're paying for it yourself. I mean, really, the system is paying for it.
Yeah, exactly. What does that mean to your reimbursement, to the total that you're getting, and is there a separate carve out that maybe needs to be done in terms of that particular item for a particular set of patients?
And Dean, let me ask you the same question. Cost control, is it about better negotiation and pricing, not using certain pharma, or what?
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on the point made at the very end there, is this idea of reimbursement. I think from a pharmacy standpoint, we need to be involved with the reimbursement and contracting decisions and drawing attention to areas where there may be opportunity, as was said, to carve those things out. And if we don't push that agenda, who's going to know from the contracting side where there might be opportunities there? So that's certainly important, although the reimbursement part is continually changing and shrinking. There's still some opportunity there. I have to agree with the things that were said. I mean, the idea of looking at what drugs should you be using, and then within that cadre of drugs, understanding where our opportunity is from pricing, negotiation. Should we limit the use of certain pharmaceuticals? I think the answer to that is yes, especially if we can't make the argument for the cost versus the benefit of it in terms of care of our patients. We have to be willing to draw lines where clinically appropriate, and through that manage the cost from that perspective. So I think I would agree that all of these are key.
Let me ask you a question on this issue of like cutting out a drug, not using a drug. It doesn't prove that it really does a better job and it's more expensive. Are those still the fights internally that they were 5 to 10 years ago, where if providers, physicians, et cetera, gotten a more understanding of it's not every new drug that we need to have? What's the temperature on those discussions today?
Certainly in our world, not anywhere near the type of discussion it has been in the past. Those of us who've been in this work a long time remember some of those difficult battles. But I think it becomes much more of a clinical discussion and a real reality in terms of understanding the impact on the organization and the benefit. I still think it still requires a very clear review of the information and a clear understanding of the literature. And I think the other thing is that we need to be aware that information may change, and the decision we make today may not be the decision we make a year from now, depending on the change in the available information and the need of our particular population. So I think all of those are important pieces.
Yes, and Luke, let me ask you sort of a follow-up to this. Cost control. The major things you can do about it. People talk about the healthcare inflation and pharmacy inflation particularly. You see hospital reimbursements rising 1% to 2% a year at many places at best. Pharma inflation is going up 5 to 10% a year. Is there anything that could be done negotiation-wise with the pharma companies, or is it almost impossible?
I think it really comes back to leveraging the evidence, looking at which agent in a clinical scenario has the best evidence supporting its use from safety and efficacy. And really beyond that, if you have multiple agents that are really on the market, that's when you really try and leverage your competition and really bring them to the table for discussions like that.
When you have alternatives, without alternatives, if somebody's got the only drug for something and the physicians and providers and patients community believes it's the only drug, there is no leverage. But if you have multiple different biosimilars or agents that could work for the same problem, then you've got some room for negotiation.
Yeah, and really when it's that sole source agent, or really, like you said, there's no major competition out there, it's really focusing on identifying its place in therapy, making sure it's being used as intended or being used as studied, really, potential criteria for use, et cetera.
Thank you. And Cedric, really to follow up on this question, is cost control about negotiations and pricing? And it sounds like from everybody, it's not the main driver, it's one driver. But then also, what technology has been helpful? I.e., what's the most useful new technology you're using in the pharmaceutical side or drug control cost side?
Scott, I have to agree with my colleagues in regards to the cost management strategies and cost control. Just to echo again, the key decisions around the utilization of drugs, and for Novant, it's around our core P&T principles, which is clinical gap. Is there a gap in therapy? I think you addressed it with a question around sole source or sole agent identified for therapy. Safety of a particular product in comparison to what's available. The efficacious value when we compare products in a particular genre or category for disease management. And then last but not least is affordability. And so the affordability for sure comes into place when we talk about, again, for Novant, as we look at our clinically integrated network or delivery network, we see the shift in how we're utilizing drugs to more of the ambulatory space. So to look at that, you have to pay close attention to obviously the outcomes associated with therapies, the site of care where that therapy is best suited to be delivered, and then most importantly, the reimbursement modeling around that. For us at Novant Health, we are a disproportionate share entity, and so we supply a great deal of services to our uninsured or underinsured patient population. And so we take that in consideration when we look at drugs that are available to be utilized for clinical outcomes and decisions. I think from the IT and integration space, for us, we're on one platform which serves us well across our footprint for the health system in both the outpatient and inpatient setting. So that allows for us to see clearly we can see therapies across our footprint as patients go from the acute care space to the clinic and back and forth, and even in our pharmacies. So we're all an integrated health system from the EMR standpoint. I would say from a supply chain, when you look at how you're maximizing your spend, there are systems out there that help with managing your 340B spend and maximizing best pricing around that, as well as looking at how you manage your inventory in your individual sites, as well as a corporate entity. And then I think we can't forget, and I think Dean highlighted that, is the artificial intelligence or the analytics, being able to get to the analytics around appropriate utilization, and partners in the space that are helping us make smarter or more robust decisions around the appropriate use of therapies and the setting that they should be used. So I think from the IT space, there's tremendous ground that still needs to be covered, but we are making tremendous strides in that space at Novant Health.
Thank you very much. Let me ask this, and without touting any particular vendor, nobody's a sponsor of this, nothing of that sort, but
yeah.
If each of you have any particular technology, and you can name it by name, it doesn't matter to us, I don't want you to slam anybody because I'm not interested in getting sued, but if there's any piece of technology that you actually liked, specifically that you'd like to point out, feel free to do that. Cedric, I'll start with you. You mentioned something you're using for the 340B side. I didn't know if there's a specific program or something you use, because I think listeners always find it helpful.
Right.
You don't have to say something specific if you want.
Yeah, for sure, Scott. So for us at Novant Health, we use MacroHelix. There's other systems out there for 340B management, but we use MacroHelix as our split billing software. We are an Epic enterprise, so we use Epic for our EMR. When we talk about our specialty pharmacy, we have Theragy in regards to being able to manage patients. So there's a lot of integrated systems that we use. When we talk about our supply chain management, we have a strong partnership with Becton Dickinson in regards to Pyxis management. So for us, we look at strategic partners and what they bring to the table to help us maximize the best use of our medicines within our system.
Thank you very, very much. Luke, same question for you. Any specific technology you use that you find particularly helpful? And feel free to mention my name if you think it's helpful to the audience.
Yeah, I think one of the most user-friendly and really easiest ones to use that's out there is McKesson Spend Analytics. Now, it really allows you to draw some great comparisons from year-over-year purchases. You can look at really what specific agents might be driving increased costs, and it really allows it in a way that you can quickly and easily manipulate it and get even a graphic depiction if you need. And I think another good opportunity really in the world of data analytics is looking at comparing it to different institutions and really boiling it down to a unit of service. We know if we have an ICU with a similar patient population in this setting, comparing the drug spend in that ICU to another ICU really allows for great comparisons and opportunity.
And that's really helpful. And then it goes to Chuck's point of you could have all the information in different places, but it's persistence in actually putting it to work and trying to then get things to closer to the mean or to where you're doing well. Is that you get all the information that's really helpful, and then it really takes real work to try and drive it down to the costs that are the places that are doing better in cost.
Thank you, Scott. This is Chuck. Can I just add one point to that right there? And that is the technologies that have been mentioned and probably ones that Dean has great expertise on are valuable, but from my perspective, the most important element for me individually is that technology is easy for me to use, and it needs to be stuff that I can see without having to spend 5 minutes to go in on a daily or weekly basis to look for it. So I would also add that the enhancement to those technologies is it needs to be functionally useful, workable for the director of pharmacy or the executive or whoever it is that is trying to manage that work. Because if it requires a half hour to get the data you're looking for, then you're probably not going to get to it as frequently as you would like.
Well, that's right. I mean, it just has to be, God, I've got an echo, I'm sorry, really user-friendly today to use, to be able to get to and use and put to use, because if you're spending lots of time stressing and mental energy and your team is using that to get the data, then by the time they've got the data, they don't have the energy to do the important part, which is trying to drive down the cost or manage the cost.
Yeah, and I
ask you to comment.
Could I just make one more point? Okay.
Please do. Yes.
Well, no, I was just going to make one more point, and that is that, if you're looking at stuff that you want people to take action on today in the hospital setting, if you look at what happened last month, it's what happened last month. It helps you for the future, but you can make a lot of specific change on a daily basis if that information on the drug costs per patient day or the drug charges is in the hands of the people right away that are going, oh, wow, we must have added a new hemophilia patient or whatever. And I think that goes back to my point of the timeliness of the data.
And so one of the keys being real-time information, so you could, and then you have to have people on it, really working the data and working the actions that are, the data itself is not an end in itself, it's a tool to then try and make change. But you really want it real time. I mean, you just like in the old days, you got it in a month, and by the time you get it, it's really hard to work with and make useful changes on it. Dean, let me ask you, I don't know if I called on you here. I know I called on Cedric and Luke, I think. Any thoughts on this technology?
Yeah, I mean, I could echo many of the comments that were made, but when you talk about data, I'll just take a moment on that, is the fact that, you know, we've taken the approach of not only consolidating our data in a very useful data warehouse, which is all well and good, but it doesn't answer the question is how do I get that data in a useful form? And so moving it out to the people who can use it in a way, pushing data to them based on their need, creating dashboards that present the data in real time or near real time so that evaluations can go on, whether that's cost information, utilization information, and even outcomes information, so that we're able to use it in the decision-making process. I think that's a key component, and we've gone a long way combining the systems that we purchase plus our own internal work to develop those kind of tools so that the data is available in a timely and useful manner. And I think people do react to that. If I understand and know the implication of the decisions I'm making, then it can help me to make the most cost-effective decision for the current circumstance. So good systems, you know, we use Epic, we use our TPA system, we use various other systems like this, but we also utilize internal evaluation of that data. I would say that we've recently begun working with Premier and using their service line analytics. And my pharmacy leadership has found the way that presents the data in a comparative fashion down to the patient and the disease state level as being something that has helped them to drive a number of decisions in the last several months.
Thank you. I've got one more question that's a planned question, then I've got several questions from the audience. On the planned question, I'd love everybody to try and limit your answer to almost, you know, not one word, but 15 seconds. And so, Chuck, let me start with you. Anything that you see is just uncontrollable, that you can't seem to get control over?
Yeah, our drug shortage related costs. I think we talked about that. That's the one piece that is frustrating us.
Oh, that's great. That's exactly great. That's really helpful. Dean, same question.
I'd have to give the same answer. The one thing that we talk about constantly is how to get your arms around the cost associated with the drug shortages.
Fascinating. Luke, and then Cedric, the same question. Anything that just feels uncontrollable. I thought it would have been. It's so interesting because I thought it would have been non-generic drugs where somebody's got the only game in town, but that's not really, that drives it for that particular condition or issue. But the real big cost is the drug shortage issues that then cause problematic spending. Cedric?
Yeah. No, I would agree, Scott. It's truly the disruptor, drug shorts.
Fascinating. Now I'm going to move to audience questions. And for a couple of these, I'd love to, again, stick to 15-second answers. That was fascinating to me, and it's probably not fascinating to our audience, but fascinating to me as a layperson, that drug shortage is the biggest problem, not a non-generic single type of the only game in town type of drug. The rebates. And Cedric, I'll start with you. Do you believe that you're maximizing rebate programs?
Scott, and so rebates. What I would say around that is there's always room for improvement. I think through our partnership with Vizient, we're able to maximize as a health system our GPO spend and our rebates in the space for our contracts with manufacturers. And then on the outpatient side, same thing. When you really look at the rebate structure, for us, we're taking a hard look at the third-party administrative space and looking at PBM management and rebates that are associated with that as well, Scott. So I would say it's an ongoing pathway for us, but that's something that we monitor pretty close.
And it's really like everything else we've talked about. It's constant work to make sure you're doing the best you can on getting the rebates you can get. Luke, Dean, Chuck, any comments on that question about rebates?
No, nothing in particular. I think they're just, it's one of those areas that I'm not a particular fan of rebates because I think they complicate our decision making about the actual cost of the drug. But for practical purposes, if you fixed it this week, you probably need to fix it again next week.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add on to the question about rebates? If not, we'll move to the next question on precision-based medicine. Let me ask you this and see if somebody could jump in on this question. Analytical tools to assess the effectiveness of precision-based medicine. Where are people at in the continuum of knowledge in being able to analyze what's being called precision-based medicine? Does anybody want to jump on that, Chuck or Dean? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we're not necessarily there yet, but the key is that we need to, as we implement these practices, we ought to hand in hand, and we have hand in hand implemented an analysis strategy. The question is, how much time does it take to get to the point where you can make key clinical decisions? But if you wait until after it's been going on for some time, you've implemented changes, and then go back and try to analyze it, it becomes much more difficult. So as we implement things, it's the process of moving that forward, I think, that's key.
And anybody else have thoughts on that as this evolves with precision-based medicine and whether you got the tools to really analyze it? So no one too much on that. Another question dealt with the creeping back of drugs that were used outpatient into the inpatient setting where perhaps you can't get reimbursed on them. Any thoughts on how people are managing that issue? Cedric, did you have any thoughts on this?
Scott, I would say that is probably the routine focus for our service line discussions. And the benefit of having strong alignment and integration across our health system from the pharmacy lens. We meet on a routine basis with, and so just for context, we have physician leaders and administrative leaders for all of our service lines at Novant Health. And then our pharmacy leaders partner with those physician and administrative leaders based on the service line and the therapies that are used in the service line for the care of the patient. And so when we look at use patterns for particular drugs, that's an ongoing discussion, and it evolves based on the total cost of care for patients in both the outpatient and inpatient setting. What we find ourselves doing is driving more of the appropriate utilization of those drugs that, say, have crept back into the acute care space. It's real quick, and usually our physician partners are the ones that are driving the appropriate use in the outpatient setting versus the inpatient setting. But that's ongoing education. That's strong partnership. That's alignment around what's best for the patient, and last but not least, what's best for the organization that's taking care of the patient. And so we have a ecosystem that we truly manage that across our footprint at Novant Health.
Got it. And this was, I think, the question I reversed. I asked it wrong. It was about the creep of drugs from the inpatient setting to the outpatient setting and problems in getting reimbursed and so forth. But it's really the same. I mean, it's really, you hit the answer of really trying to manage cost and drug use across different care delivery
Yeah. So
spots and modes and so forth.
if you flip that question, though, Scott, what I would say, then the other part to that is our managed care partners in our contracting space, and still having that same triad, physician, administrator, and pharmacy partner, having a sit down with the payers in a particular space around a group of patients that we're managing, and why it's the best value for them to receive their therapies with our health system, and the utilization and the outcomes associated with it. And then you find ourselves going into, obviously, some value-based care type arrangements that we continuously look at. But it's an evolving process, but that's typically how we manage that.
Thank you. Let me do this. We're closing in on 2 o'clock. We've had just great participation from our panelists today. Chuck Daniels, Dean Perry, Luke Miller, Cedric Terrell. I appreciate your thoughts so much. I hope our audience learned a lot. I'm really pleased that you're willing to share your thoughts on what's controllable, what's not, where you've had your best luck in controlling costs, the diligence it requires to do this. I learned a lot about how much the drug shortage problem, which we read about a lot in the news, but if you're not in the business like you guys are, you don't really understand in the same way how much that's a driver of cost. So I found the whole discussion from the 4 of you really insightful. I'll encourage our audience to provide us feedback to email either myself, S. Becker, at beckershealthcare.com, or Maggie Moran, M. Moran, at beckershealthcare.com to give feedback. Cedric, Luke, Dean, Chuck, I appreciate your help so much. Just really informative. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I think we'll wrap up
Bye-bye.
for today. I appreciate our audience joining us and you guys joining us so much. Just really, really informative. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Maggie,
Appreciate it.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes our webinar today, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.